Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Man in America. I'm your host, Seth Holhouse. So the situation with Russia and Ukraine is intensifying with the potential for nuclear weapons now on the table. Russia has also started a mobilization of troops, calling in approximately 300,000 men to fight, and they're just getting started. So are we inching closer to World War III? Will Putin actually use nuclear force in Ukraine? And if he does, how's the West going to respond? And where's China in all this? Are they still one clenched fist with Russia with the ultimate goal of being an invasion of America? Joining me today is Jeff Nyquist, one of the world's leading experts on communism and geopolitics, to get to the bottom of all these questions and more. But before we get started, today's show is brought to you by Rise TV, a Patriot-owned streaming platform. Over at Rise, our mission is to uncover the truth, no matter how dark and difficult, while always holding on to hope. We've got a massive content library, an amazing community of patriots, and you get to hang out with me and my guests for the second half of every show and ask your questions and share your thoughts and ideas. So if you have any specific questions for Jeff, make sure you join us on Rise TV. There's a link for a free trial in the description below. Also, make sure you're following me on Telegram and Truth Social. My username is @ManInAmerica. You can also catch every episode as a podcast if you just want to listen. The links to my podcasts and the social media are all in the description below. And folks, by now we all sense that we're in for a bumpy ride for the foreseeable future. Much of the world is going through a process that experts are calling de-dollarization, and China and Russia are leading the charge. So what does this mean? Well, the US dollar is a fiat currency, meaning it isn't backed by anything of real value. The only thing that really gives our dollar its value is its demand around the world. But now, and especially under the corrupt and incompetent Biden regime, the rest of the world's fed up with the Federal Reserve printing money out of thin air and demanding to trade it for things of real value. Though the dollar is strong right now, it's only because people are fleeing the European currencies, and its strength is short-lived. This is why Russia has already backed its currency with gold, and many other nations are going to follow. But what happens if the dollar loses its global reserve status? Well, for most of us Americans, the US dollar is all we know, right? All of our hard-earned money is completely tied to it, whether it's through the stock market, our bank accounts, pensions, 401ks, etc. The value of our dollars, our life savings could literally be wiped out in a matter of months, weeks, or even overnight. And look, I'm not a financial advisor, so please do your own research. But I do believe that now, more than ever, it's a good time to consider transferring at least some of your wealth into physical gold and silver. Real-world assets have stood the test of time. And for this, I'm confident recommending Noble Gold. You can buy gold and silver directly. They'll ship it to your front door. Or you can even transfer your IRA into physical gold and silver with zero taxes or penalties. Now, look, I want to be really clear. You don't buy gold and silver to get rich. You do it to protect your wealth. So now's the time, folks. If you want to learn more about this, open up a new tab right now and go to goldwithseth.com. Or you can call 877-646-5347 to speak to someone right now. The folks at Noble Gold will answer all of your questions and take care of you every step of the way. Again, that's 877-646-5347 or goldwithseth.com. And look, I'm not saying Noble Gold's the only option. If you already know someone that sells gold and silver, great. All I'm saying is please act now and protect your wealth before it's too late. So folks, it's always a mixed feeling of having Jeff Nyquist on because I love talking to him and it's excellent information that he presents, but it's usually a little bit heavy with what we're facing in the world. But Jeff, in my research and my understanding, and I've got a lot of his books I've read, his blog is fantastic. He is one of the most on-point people when it comes to geopolitics, and especially with understanding how communism is shifting the global chessboard. He's been studying this for 40 years. He's authored many, many books. He has a prolific blog. And so I'm very pleased to have Jeff on my shows. Let's go ahead and welcome Jeff to Man in America.
Thanks for having me, Seth.
Jeff, thank you so much for coming on. Jeff, we were talking before the show, and you had shared with me that you had some new intel that came in just this morning that had really worried you about what is potentially happening next with Russia and probably with China. So do you just want to go ahead and dive right into this discussion that we were having?
Yeah, the thing that at first when I heard, night before last at around 6, the news started coming in. Putin was going to make a speech. They were going to do mobilization. And people were thinking, oh my gosh, he's going to mobilize 2 million men. And then the speech comes in, I don't know, 3, 4 in the morning. And our time, Eastern time, and it's he's only going to mobilize 300,000. And I thought, oh, okay, that's not so bad. But then this morning, what I'm hearing is that it's 1 million new troops, 1 million conscripts added onto that 300,000. And it's also some of these conscripts are being told, or some of these new people are being told, oh no, you're going to be fighting. You're going into a fight, but it's not going to be Ukraine. And then you've got Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, saying, oh, the war against NATO is going to be really rough, right? It's very disturbing information out of Russia. And some of the Russian people that viewed Putin's speech, now it reads differently in English in the translation. It reads like, I'm not bluffing this time, right? It's like, it sounds kind of silly, ridiculous, but not to the Russian ear. What's a lot of Russians are hearing is, oh my gosh, he's going to use nukes. They're going to nukes. This is going to be World War III. So it's very interesting. It's a nuance of language, the cultural gap between us and Russia. And I have to take that very seriously, especially when we heard from Mr. Wang of Luda Media, 57-minute tape from Guangdong, that China, the Central Committee gave a mobilization order for war against America and Taiwan and so on in April. And that they've been preparing since they organized in early May to do this mobilization, to mobilize ships, to prepare ro-ro ships to carry armored fighting vehicles and so on, and also to move their DF-41 strategic missiles around, to hide them, to move them as if they're going to launch missile strikes. And Mr. Wang told me they're going to attack the first island chain, second island chain, and beyond. They're going to blockade Taiwan. And you see, they put their sort of besieging Taiwan. They didn't actually do a blockade. They tried to intimidate everybody. People weren't intimidated, but they've got all the mechanisms ready. Everything's in motion, ready to just simply, it's like I put my hands around your throat, but I'm not squeezing yet. Very interesting. And it's the fact now that Russia and China are going together near the same time. This is very alarming. And one Russian official said, well, if NATO doesn't mobilize now, they're dead. And of course, NATO's not going to, predictably, they're not going to mobilize because they see this as just a mobilization for the Ukraine war that Russia's losing. They don't see that there's something more because for some reason, many of the experts I talk to think that Russia is out of equipment. They are out of men. They couldn't, if they tried to raise 1.3 million men, they'd have 3,000 show up. That's the kind of thing that our experts believe. I hope they're right. But this looks, Russia is a gigantic military arsenal, much of it left over the Cold War. What have they been building in their factories these last 15 years? We know they built the factories to produce new weapons. We haven't even seen the new weapons yet. So was the whole Ukraine operation just a prelude, a way to make a justification, a testing of how we would react, and then they would know what to do next? I don't know. But it's like Putin doesn't have a reverse gear, right? There's no, okay, we want peace now. We've had enough of this. No, now it's going to get crazier.
And what you also see with it, I spoke recently to Michael Yon, who's a war correspondent, and he's in Europe, and I was just texting with him back and forth this morning, and he was saying that Germany is really preparing riot police because they anticipate as they enter into the winter and people can't heat their homes, that there's going to be massive unrest. And so with Putin cutting off gas to Europe, in response to the sanctions, it's almost like he lured NATO and Europe into this trap where it's like, okay, I'm the commodity-rich country. You can sanction me, but I can still heat the homes of my citizens. He can still mine gold. He can still operate. They can grow food, etc. But by luring NATO into these economic sanctions against Russia, that gave them the ability to say, okay, we're going to cut off your energy, which will absolutely cripple Europe. And so if that was a preemptive move towards something more elevated, you'd have to say it's somewhat genius. And if you look at what's also happening out of Beijing, Beijing, China is now talking actively about dethroning the dollar, the de-dollarization, and they're already putting different things into place to prepare for financial sanctions coming from the West. So they watched what was happening in Ukraine, and now they're talking about really hardening their own currency and their own assets to protect themselves against sanctions, almost as if they're also preparing for this. So, last we talked, and we've spoken many times this year as the situation's unfolded, what you kind of brought to the table that you seem very concerned about was that this wasn't about Taiwan, this wasn't about Ukraine, and that this is really part of a very long-term strategy of this one clenched fist for China and Russia. And you've really made a strong point about Russia is not Russia like we think it is. Russia is just Soviet Union rebranded, right? It's not like it's become some free Christian nation, but really that it's a lot of the same communist mechanisms that are underneath of that still working hand in hand with the CCP as we see play out militarily right now. So are you still believing that the communist regimes of definitely of China and also those elements within Russia are still preparing for some sort of kinetic attack on the West?
It does look like it. Yeah, because if you watch what they're doing, that mobilization is war is a famous statement a Russian general said at the beginning of World War I. And so you get to the point where these mobilizations, you can't, it's enormously costly to go to levels of mobilization and then to draw back from it. And it does appear from the beginning of everything that there is no reverse gear here. We might see, and this would be really alarming. Okay, they do this mobilization, 1 million conscripts, 300,000 reservists. They go through a 3-month training or retraining cycle. They start to put these units together. Then they announce another one in 3 months. Right? Look at it's the beginning of fall. They announced the mobilizations on the 21st, the first day of fall. So then you go to the 21st, the first day of winter. Are they going to do another cycle of mobilizations, another 1.3 million men? Now you're talking about 2.6 million men adding to the military they already have. So now you're talking about 4 million men. Now you can dance, right? Now you can have a nuclear world war because you've got a really large number of soldiers to follow up on nuclear strikes. And maybe you're going to continue this process of mobilizing. And so I'm looking at this saying, everybody thinks they can't mobilize these numbers. Well, why not? The defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, said the amount we're mobilizing, the 300,000 reservists, that's only 1% of the reserves we could mobilize. Now, what he's referring to is the 25 million Russians that would be physically qualified to be able to be put under arms. Now, under the Soviet Union, it's very interesting. Under the Soviet Union in the 1980s, full mobilization was 30 million. Now, the Soviet Union had twice the population of Russia. They were 300 million people. So they could mobilize 30 million men. And the Soviet Union was equipped to do that. 30 million men, all arms nuclear war, expecting to lose 25 million of them by the end of the war. And to lose cities and to blow up denude whole countries and continents. That was and see, this is what we can't visualize because we're not differently rational as they are. What we can't visualize is that nuclear war in any sense makes sense, right? But you read the Soviet textbooks and this, Sokolovsky's Soviet military strategy, and it's all about combined arms nuclear war. The decisive weapon of the next war will be the nuclear missile weapon. What is it that Russia has put all of its eggs in what basket? Their ground forces, we know, are no good at conventional warfare, but they've modernized their missiles. They've got the hypersonic missiles. They've got the new nuclear warheads, the thermobaric warheads. They've got this specialized, high intensity, high blast, very fast moving, rocket artillery. It's strategic rocket artillery that can hit Chicago and Washington and New York and hit our strategic arsenal, our silos in the ground, maybe wipe them out. They blind the satellites, destroy the early warning with electromagnetic attacks, and then they come in and they wipe out the weapons when we don't know what's going on. In that 30 minutes of blindness and confusion, that's all they need. And then they have a disarming strike. So what do we hit them back with? A few submarine launch missiles. If they don't destroy the subs, or if they can get through. And of course, the question is, do our missiles work? Do our bombs work? Because our nuclear arsenal, famously, as the late Peter Pry, who passed away last month, was fond of saying, is that our nuclear arsenal has passed its shelf life, and nobody's doing anything about it.
And I see that there are a lot of people, especially in America, that have one of multiple ways of looking at things. I think that for some people, there's just a very strong cognitive dissonance. They don't believe. It's almost like they look at this and say, look, we're past World War II, we're past the Cold War, and they can't even wrap their head around the fact that we might be on the verge of World War III. And it's like, I'm sure that if you would have went to across Europe a few years before World War II started, they didn't see it coming either. And I think that now more than ever, we're not immune to this. But I also see there's a lot of people that say, because I've talked to a lot of folks about this too, and said, look, this is a real threat. Whether it's China or Russia, it's a real threat. And I'm consistently met with this response of like, they would never attack America. America's the best military. We've got better weapons. And look, maybe if Trump was still in office and he was hammering away at building up our military might and bringing our nuclear arsenal back to where it needs to be, et cetera. But the opposite is happening. So for people that say, look, it would be suicide for Russia and China to attack America, what would your response be?
No, see, I watch, when I watch popular movies where nuclear weapons enter into it, it's like the fallout will kill everybody. It'll wipe out everybody. No, ever since On the Beach, people have had this thought that fallout surrounds the world in a cloud and kills everybody. That is complete fiction. It's not true. You'll have a few more cancers and leukemias. And you'll have, if anybody, grazes sheep or has a garden in the crater of a nuclear blast, they're going to probably have a higher chance of getting a cancer. But in reality, life goes on. And they don't understand. The Russian leaders understand this very well, the Russian military leaders. Nuclear weapons are just weapons. And nuclear war, Russian military strategy, the book, begins with describing war. They go back to ancient warfare, and it says, well, this is how many people used to be in armies. This is how many people used to die in wars. And with each war, there's more people in the armies. There's more people dying in the war, more destruction. And until you get to World War II, and it's the most destruction and the most people dying of all. And then, okay, logically, World War III is the next step, and it's going to be more people dying, bigger armies, more destruction. And that's just, and the way the text reads is, well, that's just the process of history. That's just the way it is. We have to accept it. We're adults here. We're the adults in the room, and we accept nuclear war is the way it's going to be fought. And you go to Americans, and I was an academic, and I would talk to other Americans. Have you read, Sokolovsky and Sidorenko? And they would say, oh, no, we don't read that stuff. That's silly. Nobody's going to ever have a nuclear war. And it's like, denial is not a river in Egypt, right? Just because you don't think it doesn't mean somebody else thinks it's, oh, that Hitler guy, he's not crazy enough to do all that. Sorry. Been there, done that.
And with Putin talking about nukes, and this is actually, you and I were speaking last night about this, do you think that there is a real possibility of the nukes beginning with Ukraine? Do you think that Putin would actually start to use certain types of, say, tactical nukes in the Ukrainian region?
Some of the people I've talked to with military background are very concerned that what's being prepared is that Russia has, for example, it looks to me like, from information I've gotten, remember, Russia began the war in February with a double envelopment attack through Belarus from the north towards Kiev, and then from the south, coming across the Dnieper on the south. They crossed the Great River north and south to close off the country, cut it off from the west, cut it off from any supplies, and that failed. Well, it looks to me like there's nothing even if Russia had 1 million men to throw, we know already that logistically they cannot support larger force. They could barely support the size of forces that they had sent the first time. So how are they going to do it this time? Tactical nuclear weapons are the only way that they could possibly be contemplating this. The fact that they're not putting it in reverse and looking for peace means they're going to go to the next level. And there's some people that are saying they're going to do it. And I have to say, it looks like they're going to do tactical nukes because they're preparing airfields in Crimea and Belarusia as if they're going to receive aircraft. And what difference are those aircraft going to make unless they're going to launch missiles that have some, maybe thermobarics, hopefully not nukes, but if they use nukes, they could level Ukraine and they could simply send light forces forward, supported by nuclear weapons, to blast any opposition out of the way and cut Ukraine's rail and communication lines to the west so that they can destroy the Ukrainian army from behind. And that seems to me what they could be preparing to do. It's the indications are that something like that is being contemplated. And this mobilization shows it's more than contemplated. They're taking steps. And then the question is, what will NATO do? And I think we have a clear idea of what NATO will do and the US will do. People are just outraged at the way Russia has behaved. I mean, Putin's speech, if you look at Putin's speech, it's outrageous lies. The Nazi regime in Ukraine is threatening to destroy Russia. Wait a minute. Nobody's invaded Russia. Nobody's threatening Russia. Nobody's even saying they're going to nuke Russia. You just got Ukraine wants to be independent. That's a threat, not to be under Russia's heel. So then we have to go in to destroy the Nazis or they're going to destroy us. I mean, this is just pure lies. And that, and NATO, these people are saying, these poor Ukrainians, we want to help them. And it's really coming from the public feeling for the underdog, especially the leadership that Poland has shown, because Poland is very worried about Russia reasserting its empire. And because they were part of that, they suffered under that. And many of the countries in the former Eastern Bloc, the Baltic states and Romania, they're worried. I've even heard Bulgarians say, we don't want to be under Russia again. And so this is a very powerful feeling. And so what you've got now is you've got this resistance. They did a poll in Germany on the 9th of September. Are you willing, do you really want to suffer this economic collapse and loss of energy, loss of gas from Russia, you know, for Ukraine? 70% of Germans said, yeah, we do. The German, this is amazing. The German public is willing to go through this suffering for the sake of Ukraine. So when they nuke Ukraine, how are people going to feel? Outraged, afraid. People don't want to live under the fear of Russia. If Russia gets away from this, everyone will live under fear. And they don't want to.
And do you think that if Putin did use nukes in Ukraine, because I know that we've already had various, world leaders talking about how like that seems to be the tipping point, right? Right now, they're sending money over there and some troops and some weapons, but it seems like the use of nukes in Ukraine would be the tipping point. So do you think that that's what would then cause NATO to maybe attack Moscow? Or, I mean, is that what then would launch us into what I would say would be the realistic version of World War III?
Well, you see, the problem is to understand the mentality of Americans and Europeans when it comes to World War III nuclear weapons. The idea of using nuclear weapons like that is just horrifying. A lot of our policy experts or strategists look at a nuclear weapon as something that sits there and looks pretty and scary and prevents war. So nobody, I mean, even Henry Kissinger said this last year. He said, nobody's had the discussion, what if deterrence fails, right? Well, the Russians not only had that discussion, but for half a century, they've been talking about that deterrence has no real meaning, that when it comes down to war, you're going to use these weapons. They don't really deter. And so I don't know how we get over this mentality, but our leaders are going to have to get over it pretty fast. And they're going to have to recognize this. So, but knowing our leaders, I don't see them rushing to push the button when it's tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. They're going to denounce Russia, and they're going to, you think Russia's got any, I mean, look, the Russian companies on the New York Stock Exchange have not even been kicked off. I mean, a lot of people don't know this. I mean, the sanctions on Russia aren't absolute. Russia is still carrying on a lot of business. If they use tactical nuclear weapons, you talk about being cut off. Germany has nationalized Gazprom not Gazprom, Rosneft, the Russian oil company property. I think it's 3 facilities in Germany. Everything, every single piece of Russian property in the West is going to be nationalized. And that's going to be a huge blow. And China, the Russians, this is very important. If Russia uses tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine, it will only be because the Chinese Politburo gave it a big thumbs up.
Really?
There's no way Russia would do it without the support of China.
Do you think
China's the big economic power in their bloc? And so China's going to have the final say.
And do you think that China, and specifically Xi Jinping and the CCP Politburo, do you think that they are masterminding a lot of what's happening in Ukraine?
Well, they agreed to it. Look, when Putin went to China on the 4th of February and they had their meeting, their joint statement is worth reading. That joint statement says that Russia and China together formed the most powerful military political combination since World War II.
Which is very true.
Well, yeah, if we just look at their conventional military, Chinese has a very large conventional military. At full mobilization, the Russians look pretty impressive, but the quality isn't there. They don't have the training. They don't have the good officers. They don't have the right military doctrine, unless they're using nuclear weapons. It's the big equalizer. It's like this skinny kid and this really fit kid going to have a fight, but the skinny kid has a knife or a gun or something that gives him the advantage. You know, if I'm a 90-pound weakling and I have a gun, and you're a famous boxer, world-class boxer, and you have a gun, we're equal.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, that's what the nuclear weapon does. It levels the playing field. And of course, but it does more than that. The person who's willing to use the weapon first in a large way has an advantage, psychologically and physically. And then you have this terror propaganda that nuclear weapons are the end of the world, this false apocalyptic consciousness, when nuclear weapons are just weapons. They're terrible. They're more destructive than anything that we've used. But in World War II, Germany was leveled with conventional weapons. The equivalent of 600 atomic bombs in conventional weapons was dropped on Germany in World War II. And Germany's fine, right? It was rebuilt. You can destroy Hiroshima. The streetcars were working the next morning. It's a nice, thriving city right now. It's not the end of the world, but it is war with terrible destruction. And one side can win if it is prepared more, if its concept of war is correct. And this is the big question. Many of our economists and people who look at Herman Kahn on thermonuclear war, he talked about recovery from nuclear war being possible within 5 years, provided you practice free market economics. The thing about Russia and China is they don't work that way. Even when they do free market economics, it's not really free market economics. It's only partially so. And so the interesting thing is, they don't, for many of our experts go, well, they would lose, because we look at their ability to recover. And they wouldn't recover. They would collapse too. As bad as they would give it to us, they would suffer. Some months later, they would suffer collapse. That's the good news, that they can't win. The bad news is, how many months, or could it be 2 years, could they go on like this, destroying, conquering? That's the frightening part.
And the conversation that we had recently, that was based upon a lot of the information from Luda Media and Mr. Wong, you revealed, and in that came out, that there was what seemed to be a very concrete plan for a kinetic war against America. And I remember talking to you before, and also listening to, and reading through the transcript of the leaked conversation with these high-level military generals, that it seemed like everything that they were doing was so much bigger than what would just be Taiwan. And I think that we're seeing the same pattern in Russia right now. If it was just Ukraine, why would they be mobilizing 1.3 million troops if it was just Ukraine?
And they're telling their men, like I said before, they're telling them, oh, you're going to be fighting when you get done with your training, but you're not going to be fighting in Ukraine. And it's like, what?
So where do you think they will be fighting? Like what in your opinion, what comes next?
Well, I can only say what I would do, trying to crawl in, you want to, in strategy, you want to crawl inside the other guy's head and see it through their eyes as much as you can. That's not an easy exercise, and not everybody can do it. And I've tried to understand the way they think, which is not the way you or I would think. So if what I say sounds impossible and strange, it's because it's from an alien kind of thinking. So this is the way they think. If they can cause enough destruction fast enough, collapse the West, they have, look at their strategy. This is very interesting. There's a book, very famous old book, Soren Kierkegaard, The Sickness Unto Death, right? Soren Kierkegaard, it turns out, has an insight that is very vital to communism and Nazism, all totalitarianism. He says in here, despair is sin, right? Despair is sin. And he's got all these, he goes on, he progressively, he dialectically goes through despair is sin, all these forms of sin. And sin is error. That's another word for sin. And if you look at the rhetoric of the Nazis, what did Hitler do? He said, oh, poor Germany. Germany's a victim. Oh, Germany, despair. The Jewish Bolsheviks and the Jewish capitalists have destroyed you. And now you only have one choice. You have to you have to go against them all. Well, Russia's doing the same thing. It's the evil conspiracy of the Nazi American NATO, the American NATO Nazis and Ukrainians. Only there's been an intellectual degeneration. So it's under the Jewish Rothschilds, it's a Jewish Nazi conspiracy. So, but it's poor Russia. Russia's a victim. Despair Russia. Well, what is despair? Look at, if people examine their own lives, as Kierkegaard did, where do you get the permission to do some of the worst things you've done in your life? It's from feeling sorry for yourself. It's from that despair. You feel sorry for yourself, so you're going to strike back. You're going to lash out. You're going to act out. You're going to be bad. And you see this bad behavior emerging from envy, emerging from self-pity. I mean, this is the secret, the dirty secret of the narcissistic rage is a narcissist feels that he's been a victim and he's entitled now to have his. And you look, when I look at Putin's rhetoric, this is so loud in the way he talks. It's like Hitler saying, the Versailles Treaty, they injusticed us, they took our territory. And it's Putin, it's like, it's the end of the Cold War, they stole from us, we're going to get it back, And it's the same exact chip on the shoulder. Poor me, we're the victim, we have the right, we need to, lash out. I mean, that made Hitler madly the enemy of the whole world. The United Nations came out of the alliance that fought Hitler. It was all the countries that fought Hitler was the United Nations. That's what they called it. The United Nations fought Hitler. And so now he's doing again, only this time, this is almost like a comedy. Karl Marx, kind of paraphrasing Hegel, said in one of his books, he said, history always repeats itself. The first time is tragedy, the second time is farce. Well, here's the farce. Here's little Putin being little Hitler, reprising the Anschluss in Austria, only he stubs his toe. He can't even take Ukraine over in an Anschluss. Anschluss was when Hitler just marched into Austria and they just waved the flags and said, welcome, welcome. We love the Fuhrer. But he goes in and they don't want it. Stubs his toe. And now all the world hates him, except for his Chinese allies and his communist friends in Cuba and North Korea. All the world hates him. And so he's skipped all these steps. He has not successfully taken all this territory back. And all the world hates him, but he's got one thing Hitler didn't have. He's got nukes. And he's got no reverse. CCP. Yeah, and he's got the CCP, right? Nukes in the CCP, and he's got no reverse gear. So he's not turning around and going, oops, I'm going to be the nice guy now. I'm going to be the nice Nazi or the nice dictator now. He's not. He's just getting meaner and crazier.
And this is what concerns you, right? But with not only Russia, but also with China, that they're, in a lot of ways, they're a rattlesnake backed into a corner. And now is when they might be even taking risks that they wouldn't normally do because, and maybe we can talk a little bit about this too, but China, as far as I understand, is very, very close to collapsing. Their economy is failing. The COVID stuff is really hitting them, a lot of it being done by them. But let's talk a little about where China's at, because if you look at the situation that the CCP is in, they're like similar. They're in a similar position where I'm concerned about how frantic they would be, especially towards the West at this time.
Yeah, there's a saying in the book of Proverbs, he who digs a pit will fall into it, right? And you use the term being backed into a corner, but the better analogy is they, both Russia and China, have painted themselves into a corner. And I saw this, there was a great cartoon, and it was Putin, and he would use the color red, and he had painted this room, and he had painted himself all the way into the corner where he's standing in the corner with the original color behind him with the paintbrush and the bucket, and everything's red, and now he's stuck, right? Because that's what he's done. But let's review China for a minute. We know how Putin painted himself into the corner with this Ukraine thing, escalating to this point. China, remember, it was actually late 2019, this virus got out. And this is my theory about the virus from the sources I've gotten. This is very controversial, and I could be wrong. Whether the virus got out accidentally or they released it on purpose, they went with it. And we could see this, that they allowed, remember that, heroic Chinese dentist who was in the ER around the beginning of, it was like the last couple of, if I remember right, it was the last day or two of the year 2019. And he was in an ER, and, oh yeah, we have these new people that are sick. We have this new illness. He was like, you have a new illness? And, they remembered that they had SARS before, and he's thinking a SARS-like illness. So he let people know about it. And what ended up happening was he got called on the carpet by the party secretary, I think the local party boss, and he said, you're a party member. You can't say this. You're in trouble. And they were hiding the pandemic. And then they allowed the pandemic to spread in Wuhan. They had the New Year's celebration. And in the New Year's celebration, the city fathers wanted to cancel the potluck and the dance. But Beijing, the order came down from Beijing, you do not cancel those events. And it was at that potluck that thing just went wild everywhere, because it spreads like the common cold. And then and of course, Chinese New Year's is the biggest travel day in China. It's when all these Chinese come from, especially Italy, where the textile industry is bound up with China, and from the US and Australia. And these Chinese, they go out from the infected Wuhan to all over the world carrying the virus to Europe, to North America, to Australia. And bam, there it was. And by the way, that had an effect on China. Now they closed off Wuhan to the other Chinese cities. And I think the virus, and this is what I think the virus was initially more dangerous than it is now. It mutated to a more harmless kind of flu. I think also that when they tested this weapon, they tested it on their Laogai prisoners. And remember, the people vulnerable to dying are people who don't have zinc or vitamin D in their bodies. What do you think a Chinese prisoner has in terms of zinc and vitamin D, given what they're fed? So they probably gave those to prisoners, and they found that half of them were dying of this thing, or maybe more. And they thought, oh, this will sweep the West. This will destroy the West. And we'll just batten down China. See, look at the extraordinary measures of blocking people in their apartment complexes. It turned out their weapon was a dud. See, they were intending something bad. And I think what happened is the bad vibes, they were really guilty. They didn't remember the Australian prime minister. He got all upset and he said, we need to investigate where this came from. And China immediately reacted so harshly, they went into a kind of an economic spat with Australia, ended up stupidly cutting off their own coal shipments, caused them to have to close down a lot of their industries because they didn't have enough coal to keep the lights on. So it turns out this hypersensitivity and China's behavior, a lot of people turned against China. A lot of people were like, I don't think this China trade thing is good. And although the China had a tremendous hold on Western industry, they went a step back, and Trump was already putting the screws on in trade, trying to do his trade thing. So they took on damage. And since they were communists and they're corrupt, and there's a lot of their banking system's a house of cards, and their real estate is it's just a giant bubble waiting to burst. It basically, all of this burst that bubble. And whereas they might have wanted to wait and go do World War III, 15, what I heard was, the word was that they were going to do this attack in 2035. They were going to do their war. But this stumble is forcing them to go early when they're not entirely ready.
Oh, interesting. I see.
Because their society, they're sitting on 1.4 billion people. It's a powder keg. If they can't control that society turns on them. How are they going to control 1.4 billion angry people who are hungry, and the economy's collapsing and there's no jobs? So they have to teach the Chinese, as General Chiao Chen says in his speech, we have to teach the Chinese people to go out, because eventually they'll hang us all as criminals. I mean, he literally says that in his speech, because China will eventually suffer an economic downturn. They'll blame the Communist Party. So the Communist Party has to have war on the shelf ready to go in case things go wrong.
I see. So
Right.
with China, and I do think a lot of the timing of this has been driven by China. And you've already said that, look, they won't, Russia wouldn't use nukes without the thumbs up from someone up in the Politburo or Xi Jinping
Right.
himself. So that basically, if I'm understanding correctly, and this really makes a lot of sense, because my own research had led me to believe that the virus was not supposed to be released that early, but they had to release it earlier because one of the big reasons, because Trump weakened them so much with his sanctions and his tariffs, and they had to get him out of office. And that became one of the great tools that they used to do what they did in 2020, right? It was all under the guise of the virus.
And if they were going to get Trump out, they needed a weak leader to come in, that then if they had to have a war, they'd be facing a very weak American president.
Makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
And so the timing of all of this, and the reason why we're seeing things play out as they are, instead of what you said, China waiting strategically, because China has never been in a rush. They've got their 100-year marathon. Their goal was to supplant America by 2049, right? That was the original 100-year marathon. And so basically, it's almost like they lit off a bomb of the COVID virus, but the fuse screwed up. It didn't go off right. It ended up hurting them more than their enemy. And so now they're in a situation where that caused this ripple effect of kind of collapsing a lot of their society. And because they were so harsh with their lockdowns and everything, the only option that they have is to try to quickly turn into a war economy and enter into a global war. Because if they just if they were patient and played the long game, they don't have time anymore. And their society would probably collapse and revolt, and the CCP would fall in the next couple of years. So if I understand correctly, then so China is in a very, very weakened state, which also makes me very concerned, because that's when the enemy is the most sporadic. That's when the enemy will do things that wouldn't normally make sense.
Right. And it was really interesting. I was hearing from sources in Russia 2 years ago, more than 2 years ago, that China was pushing for war in late 2020. And they were pushing for Russia to start things. They were talking about it in April and May of 2020. And Russia was saying, no, we're not ready. We can't go. We can't possibly go now. And that this was what I was hearing from my sources. And that it was really interesting. It was Russia putting on the brakes. And as we can see, Russia, even waiting till February of 2022, Russia was not ready, clearly. They did not have their act together as much as they thought they did. And so you could see that Russia's nervousness about being ready, being pushed from behind by China, it just miscarried for them. We might, if Russia didn't have these problems, we might already be in World War III. The Ukrainians may have saved us by holding them back. Just like if Hitler had been stopped in Austria or Czechoslovakia, there might not have been a World War II. And so, that's the good news. But the problem is they're not reversing gear. Putin hasn't been overthrown. Xi is on schedule. In fact, one of the sinister signs was the big party meeting scheduled in November that was going to, that Xi was going to, re-up his dictatorship, has been advanced, I think, to the 16th of October. So it's like, why did they move that up?
That's probably
why move it up? And October's a pretty interesting month because that's when the seas are calm around Taiwan, when you would impose a blockade or do an invasion, as those people who believe that an invasion is coming. But because Chi Hao-chen said in his speech 20 years ago, we're going to make them think our target is Taiwan, but our target is America. And that really troubles me because they're making everybody believe their target is Taiwan, but their mobilization is much larger, as the 57-minute tape showed. It's much larger than just Taiwan. And this was confirmed by Mr. Wang at Luda Media, who basically, interestingly, affirmed that. A guy who, he really doesn't know my work or the defector sources I use. Colonel Stanislav Lunev talked about this strategy of, sort of roping off the rest of the world, making it shake in terror as they come right for North America. And that's a combined nuclear arms, the old combined nuclear war. And the thing is that they don't want to nuke Europe. They want Europe intact because Europe is going to be their milk cow. It's going to provide all the milk and honey for them when they dominate the world. The same thing with China and the Far East. They don't want to devastate the Far East. They want to own it as their golden basket. Right. And they just Russia and China, to understand their strategic thinking, is imagine if North America sank like Atlantis into the ocean and it didn't exist. Who would dominate the world? Russia and China. Not one of the other countries have nuclear arsenals or military establishments large enough to stop China. I mean, India is a very large country. And it's got a very big military establishment, but they've got just a tiny nuclear arsenal that is not properly positioned, that could easily be wiped out, and would not. A nuclear war between Russia and China would be hands down a Chinese victory. And of course, how could India survive against a nuclear armed China if its nuclear arsenal was gone? How long before China was on its knees and having to surrender, like Japan in 1945?
That makes perfect sense.
And this is the same thing with France and Britain, are nuclear powers, but nuclear powers with just very small numbers of nuclear weapons compared to Russia. So how does a few dozen nuclear weapons or so that are effective going to be able to stop thousands on the other side?
Oh, exactly.
Yeah.
So Jeff, I've got a quick note from a sponsor, and then we'll jump right back into this. All right, so folks. My buttons. There we go. So folks, we got a quick message for you. So I'm sure a lot of you own your home. Well, the deed to your home is the only document that proves that you actually own it. The problem is, though, that the deeds to all of our homes are online now. So this means that a criminal can find your deed, forge your signature, and file a document like this as the new owner of your home. Then he'll take out the loans using your home's equity and leave you in debt. The FBI reports show that real estate fraud is one of the fastest growing cybercrimes in America, and this is already costing Americans massive amounts of money. And unfortunately, you won't know until collection notices show up on loans that you yourself never took out. Homeowners insurance doesn't cover you, and neither do common identity theft programs. Home Title Lock is your peace of mind that the deed to your home is protected, where you can protect your home equity and title for just pennies a day. So to learn more, go to hometitlelock.com/Seth and use promo code Seth, S-E-T-H. Then enter your address for your no obligation home title scan to see if you're already a victim. It's a $100 value for free. Be sure to use my promo code Seth for your free title scan at hometitlelock.com/Seth. All right, so Jeff, I want to just look into timeline because last we had talked about things. It was looking like August 1st was the timeline that China would start to make moves, more serious moves on Taiwan, which we're seeing. But in terms of, as we're just getting into this long-term plan of really realistically making America sink, do you think that there is a real possibility that there could be a kinetic attack on America? And do you think that there would be perhaps an EMP to preempt that attack? Or how would you see that playing out?
All of those things are possible. I mean, given the way the Russians are talking, if you study Russian strategic thought, they say that the most important thing is preparing the people of their country for war, for a nuclear war. And then that means orienting their people to who the enemy is and getting them used to the idea, telling them that there's going to be a nuclear war. Well, this is exactly what the Chinese authorities have been telling the Chinese people. For 2 years, they've been talking about war is coming. And right now, we're just seeing Sergei Lavrov said last week, the foreign minister of Russia, nuclear war is coming. That's a quote, a direct quote. And then his speech here, just within the last 24 hours, he's saying that the war with NATO is going to be, I forget the word he used, brutal, terrible, hard, and so this is preparing the Russian people. We have nobody on the NATO side saying that this is coming. I mean, the Germans and the Europeans, they're biting the bullet. They're going to sacrifice through the winter. They're going to sacrifice and be cold and have to suffer through a winter without adequate heating fuel. But still, I'm not sure people understand. We should be responding to these mobilizations, and we're not. This worries me.
And you've talked about, and as we discussed recently as well, that a lot of this is about how the citizens of that country view, and that's what determines the success or failure of a war many times, is what the citizens think of it. And so China, I think they view their populace as a ticking time bomb, that because there's already massive unrest and looking into lockdowns, et cetera. But you go to America, you listen to Biden and I'm the enemy. You're the enemy. You listen to, look at the DOJ and it's the parents at the school board that are the enemies. Not once are we seeing any of these public officials or politicians talk about how China is the real enemy. And if they are, they're very, very few. Now, Trump and say Pompeo, they were very proactive in really identifying China as the enemy, but that's all but disappeared, which shows you how much compromise there's been at the top levels of our government.
Well, the problem too is you have this element on the right that sees NATO as the enemy, sees America as the enemy, because they're alienated, because Biden is president, the party of gay marriage and transgenderism and everything is giving 5-year-old sex change operations. That party is in power. And you've got this left of center crazy agenda. Global warming, is just a giant sabotage of our economy, is in power in Europe. And so they look at the West as evil. The problem is that having a party in the West that alternately takes power that has these values, these false values, is not the same thing as a totalitarian dictator who is ready for mass murder and that is stomping his own people and totally trashing his neighbor's country, leveling cities, massacring civilians, and threatening the world with nuclear war. I mean, we have problems in the West, but the evil in the West is not on that level. And the thing is that the thing we ought to be doing is unifying the right and left and saying, we have this enemy, we can work out our problem. Later, we can figure it out, because I think a lot of this bad stuff that's believed on the left and the right, some of the conspiracy stuff, if you examine it, wait a minute, this sounds like Russian propaganda. What are they doing? They're trying to while they're getting ready for war against us, our right and left are getting ready for war against each other. So domestically, we're preparing for the wrong war. We're preparing for a war against ourselves. Now, the question that you always have to ask is cui bono. Who benefits from this? Well, the Chinese and the Russians benefit from it. And then you look and you go, wait a minute, we've seen propaganda like this before. Oh, coming from the Chinese, coming from the domestic communists in the US, coming from the Russians. Wait a minute, this is a Russian psyop. And we're falling for it. Left is falling for it. Right is falling for it. The left had this big thing. Trump is a Russian puppet. You have all these people left and center, they believe in it. And so then they think, oh yeah. And then now you've got people on the right actually acting like Russian puppets, which just feeds the whole thing. They go, well, see, General Flynn, he's for Russia. And so Putin is fighting the New World Order. And it's like, no, the New World Order is a communist front, and Russia is still the Soviet Union, as you said, rebranded. because guess what? Russia is supporting every communist country in the world, from the Congo and the ANC in South Africa to Cuba and North Korea. They gave North Korea its nuclear capabilities. They've been giving Iran, all of the nuclear engineers in Iran were trained in Russia. So it's all the trouble is being made from Russia. And the Russians are helping the communists. And why are they helping the Iranians? Because the mullahs went to Moscow State University. And that form of Islam is a liberation theology form of Islam. It is to Islam what liberation theology is to Catholicism. It's a communist in a collar talking about God. So this is what they've got. They've got this global communist movement, and they haven't quite been able to get it off the ground, but now they've been, as we both said, they've painted themselves into this corner, and it's like, well, I think we can nuke our way out now, as crazy as that sounds. And that's what it looks like. I hope not.
And it's such an interesting point that you bring up, and just being vulnerable in my own journey of this. I've done extensive research. I've gone down the path of reading about the bloodlines and the Rothschilds and the military industrial complex and Epstein Island and the Mossad and actually I think that there is a lot of truth to a lot of it, actually. And I think that there are very evil elements even within our own government. If you look at the Bushes and the wars that they've waged for the weapons of mass destruction and the backdoor deals with the House of Saudi, et cetera. But I think that what's happened though is that the communists, China, Russia, KGB, and this has been for a long term. What they've done, it's like it's like, say you have a house and there's a criminal living in your house that's done very bad things. What they've done is they've taken all the people living in that house and they've pointed at that criminal and said, look, your whole house should fall because of this, right? And that's what they've done. And so there are people that are, on the right that they're investigating, they're digging into things, and they're finding real things of corruption even within the U.S. government. But the problem that I see is that what they're doing is that they're looking at that information and they're saying that, oh, see, look, it's the West that's evil. And I've even had people comment and saying on my chats and say, I would, if I saw Chinese troops arrive, I would welcome them because they're going to help clear out the evil in the West. And to me, it's like that is frightening because yes, I do agree that there's evil within our government. Look at, it doesn't take a genius to see that for sure. But look at what our government did under Trump. And I think you made a really good point in saying that it's the leadership. When Trump was in power, he was doing really important things to put America first and to really make America great again. And so it's the leadership, it's the Clintons, the Obamas, the Bushes. It's have been criminals within our government, but it doesn't mean that the fabric of our nation is corrupt and evil. But if you look at, I had someone that posted ahead of this discussion and they said, look, where's your proof that Putin is evil, right? And it's just like, well, look at the history of Russia, look at the Soviet Union, look at the goals of the Soviet Union, and ask yourself if those goals didn't change when Russia, opened up to the West, when the Soviet Union fell. And that's the big point that's really helped me see through all of this. It's like, well, I see that there's evil on both sides, but what concerns me the most is that Putin is working so closely with the Chinese Communist Party. And to me, if there's one thing that you can't argue, it's that the CCP, in my opinion, is the most evil regime on earth. And anything that paves a way for the CCP to gain more global power, which is what's happening, by partnering with and working on this and doing it with Putin, this is paving the way for the CCP to enter into this world as a dominantly global force, which is, they've spoken openly about the goal of a global Marxist system. They want to completely get rid of the capitalist system. And so this is what really concerns me, is that we have people that are saying, look, maybe the CCP is not that bad. Maybe Xi Jinping is not that bad. And that's what really makes me think, wow, they've been so crafty with their propaganda, and they've made a flavor of propaganda for every person's diet in America.
Yeah, the thing is that Americans especially, are naive in that they think that somehow human nature and politics are good. If they read the Federalist Papers, if they study the Founding Fathers knew it's a basic principle. Men are evil. They're naturally corrupt, and power corrupts, like Lord Acton said. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That's because human nature is bad. This is the great insight of the ancient Greeks and Romans when they set up what they called mixed government, which is what we have. The Constitution is not a democracy. It's mixed government. You have the legislature, you have the executive, you have federalism, you have the judiciary. In England, they had the House of Lords, the House of Commons, and the Crown. And they all checked and balanced each other. Why did they have checks and balances? Because people are bad. Right? You don't want them to have the power. And people say, well, what's your ideology? You think communism is the most evil thing in the world. No, there's evil everywhere. That's why my political creed is checks and balances. Because we got evil too. And yeah, our evil, you're not going to get rid of it. Look, if you knew where your sausage was made, you would never eat it. And guess what? Politics is our nasty sausage. If you really understood what went on in politics, you would go, it's horrible. It's always been that way. Look, Mark Twain said, 140 years ago, that Congress was America's native criminal class. And then when Congress was in session, nobody's property was safe. So this isn't new that we have corruption, right? And it was H.L. Mencken who said, yeah, our robber barons are robbers, but at least they built something for everybody, right? Whereas all previous robber barons were just plain robbers, okay? So capitalism, like John F. Kennedy said, a rising tide lifts all boats. You're never going to get rid of that nasty, evil thing because it's part of who we are as human beings. Just like you're never getting rid of poverty and war. This crazy idea that people have on the left and maybe some of them on the right. If we only got rid of the malefactors of great wealth, we would be fine. No, you wouldn't. You'd be living in a cave because you got to have a free market. Okay, there's corruption. Okay, there's insider trading. These bad things happen. You try to cope with it. You have your checks and balances. That's as good as it gets. Because when you don't have checks and balances, you got that run-amok dictator like Putin with his lackeys, and you see him in that room when he's setting up the war to go into Ukraine, and he's on one side of the room, there's like 20 feet between him and them. And they're standing, it's like a first grade class, and they speak when he calls on them, and they stand there and he just humiliates them, right? That was a horrible scene. I mean, you're seeing how a dictatorship works on TV in real time, and you're watching it, you're going, that's really ugly. Because it's super corrupt. They call it a kleptocracy. And the same thing, it's worse in China. Like you say, the evil is they're taking people they don't like because they're Christians or because they're Falun Gong, and they're cutting their kidneys, and they're perfectly healthy young people, and they're taking their organs and selling them on the black market, even selling them in the West to corrupt our Western medical systems for organ transplants. It's like, oh my gosh, so yeah, evil is a matter of gradations, all evil is not equal. And you can always point to things that are wrong in the West. And we got our problems that we have to work out. But that problem over there with nuclear weapons and the insanity of it, I'll repeat what the defector, GRU Colonel Stanislav Lunev told me. I asked him, I said, are there any good people in the Kremlin or in the Russian general staff? And he looked at me like, are you stupid? I mean, he didn't say that, but I felt really stupid asking the question. He goes, these are not human beings. These are crazy persons. That's what he told me. And now we're seeing it. We're seeing it play out. This mobilization, that demented speech yesterday that Putin gave, it's just, and the reaction of ordinary Russians is like, oh no, he's going to do it. They're going to do a nuclear war. Now, whether that's a correct reaction, I'm not bluffing. My reaction to the speech was, nobody says I'm not bluffing unless they're bluffing. They play poker with someone and then they put the money down and goes, I'm not bluffing. You're going to call their bluff, right? But is that calculated? Have they culturally studied us to know that that's how we would react to that speech, whereas Russians hear it and they go, they're hearing something different.
Yeah. So in your opinion, you think that we're entering into very precarious times where we could quickly see things emerge as a real World War III. I mean, is that what is your best guess to what the next 6 months could look like?
I was starting to relax 2 weeks ago. I thought, all right, we're getting towards the end of summer. Nothing's happening. They've decided they've bungled enough. They're not going to go through with the war. I was thinking that in my mind because I wasn't seeing any signs. Russia needs to mobilize to match China's mobilization. They need to do certain things. They need to talk to their population a certain way. I wasn't seeing it. And here we were past the 15th, the middle of the month. The Arctic's going to freeze over in a couple of weeks. And I'm thinking, for full cooperation, if they're going to attack the United States, they need to do it when that ice is open. And I thought, nah, it's good. So for the last 2 weeks, I didn't have an article last week because I've been working on studying our domestic politics. And I've been working on all kinds of problems. And it was a long essay. It was planned. And then this happens, which it's like, oh no, you got to be kidding. They're going to do it now. And it's like, I hope that that's not the case, but this is another shoe dropping, in the sequence that's playing out step by step. And so it is, I go from, going, oh, thank goodness we got to the middle of September. I don't see another signs. Maybe Mr. Wang was wrong or the Chinese leadership changed their mind. But now this. After, by the way, just like the invasion in February happened after a meeting between Putin and Xi, the president of China. They had a meeting in Samarkand, Uzbekistan some days ago. And now this, like they have a huddle and now the new strategy, they go to the next step. And every time they take a big step, so this must be a big step, they meet.
And I remember back when Russia was mobilizing and they were on the border of Ukraine, and I had you on, it was before anything happened. And it was interesting because I hope that people can look to this and maybe just be a little more open-minded. But at that time you said, look, I remember you saying distinctly, mobilization is war. And you had said that you expected that Russia was going to invade Ukraine, and everything that you saw pointed to that. But even then I had a lot of people that were saying, oh, just being a fearmonger and Russia's not actually going to invade Ukraine. And this is it's all optics. And lo and behold, a couple of days later, they actually invaded. And so I just want to remind people that just try to be careful with what narrative you've got stuck in your mind. And that's what I've had to do. And I can tell you that, I've really appreciated our conversations, Jeff, because you've made me question a lot of the assumptions I had about the world, about Putin, about China, about the West. But it's me being able to enter into this conversation with an open mind and listen to you and then reference what you've said against things I've heard elsewhere, whether I'm interviewing Trevor Loudon or General Robert Spalding or just in my own research to make sense of what's happening. And I've really come to the point where, and this is why I keep asking you to come back on my show, where I think that you're one of the most accurate people in terms of understanding the real motivations of what's happening with this communist bloc. It's really, I feel like that they're in their end game. That this is, China talked about their final war, and that's what they talked about in that leaked military speech. This is their final war, and I really believe that we're at that stage in history, and that I think that I agree with you that it wasn't supposed to be this soon, but there's been a lot of circumstances that have really pushed up that timeline, and that we're at this timeline. And so I think that this is why I talk a lot about prepping. All the things that I talk about, it's because I believe this is where we're at. But I also think that it's important for people to understand, and you and I have had this conversation many times, that just because that China and just because they are so powerful nuclear, the amount of troops they can mobilize, it doesn't mean that they could successfully take America. And you made a really important point in saying that, look, say they did attempt a land invasion on America, whether they could last a couple of months and be able to supply that invasion with their own population, probably revolting back home, So that, you felt that, look, if they don't collapse before that there is this attack potentially, that even after attack, there's a good chance that they would fall before being able to complete their mission.
Yeah, there's a, we've all often talked about the dumbing down of America, and we've heard about how we can see the intellectual standards have been in decline. But one of the things that's really amazing is that the intellectual standards in Russia and China have declined. And that's very interesting in terms of their top leadership. Xi Jinping, I'll give you an example. Xi Jinping styles himself as the greatest leader in China since Mao. And they say he has collected to himself the most power. Now, he is, in many ways, a typical Chinese functionary, not really the kind of leader you saw in Mao. So you see, Mao was a genius. You pick up the little red book, and I've got it around here somewhere, and you turn it up, and there's these amazing, even in translation, they're aphoristic, they're interesting, political power flows out of the barrel of a gun. There's profundity there. The guy's a genius. And as anyone, fluent in Mandarin will say, he's a great Chinese poet. He actually is, and so you could see how this man made this murderous system work because he had the genius to make it work. Then you look at Xi Jinping. All right, he is the new Mao. Okay, you look at his book. Everybody can look at his book. It's The Governance of China, I think is the title of his book. Go to Amazon and look at the reviews. The third review down says, this is the biggest snooze fest book ever, And other ones saying, read page 1 and then just imagine 145 pages exactly like page 1. Right? So this guy is a mediocrity, no imagination, dull as a brick, and he just makes up for it for this tremendous lust for power. And of course, it's murderous and stuff, but it's not brilliant. It has no brilliance. You go, Putin basically looks up to Stalin. Stalin is his model. I spoke to an elderly Russian lawyer a couple of years ago. She Simona Pipko, she's from the Soviet Union. She studied law, and she met Stalin in, I think it was in Leningrad. He came to talk to their law class when she was a young law student, and she said he had tremendous charisma. And when you heard him, you just knew what he was saying had truth in it. That Stalin, even as evil as he was, he had truth. He could penetrate into things, and he could see in a twisted way what the truth was. And so he was the genius that built the Soviet house, that made the machine. And even when you look at his books, I mean, I've got some of his books here, like Fundamentals of Leninism. It is so exact and so precise and so amazingly clear. Stalin was the person who made Marxism and Leninism clear, because you could read those books and go, what did I just read? Because it's so abstract. And so he had this genius for simplifying it and making it so that this huge bureaucracy could actually function on it. And then you look at Putin. I mean, if hat size indicates intelligence, how smart could Putin be? I mean, his hat size is too small. He's not that smart. He's an envious little guy who swaggers, who puts a swagger in his walk to make up for his size. So it's like, look at the decisions they made. Look at the rhetoric, the Russian rhetoric, as I said before. It's just not even coherent. So wait a minute, you can't even make a coherent rhetoric justification for what you're doing? You're attacking a Nazi regime led by Jews? Really? This is not even coherent. So it's like, you talk about dumbing down of America, there's been the dumbing down of America's enemies. And so this is where it gets really interesting, because it's like, are they even smart enough to pull this off? I mean, to what extent? Now we know China, because of what Trump did, China started to implode. But from, I talked to this Wall Street banker who said they're doing it to themselves. These steps that they're taking and these recent preparations they're doing within their own economy are destroying their own economy. I mean, the zero tolerance policy, which is probably hiding mobilizations, it's just accelerating their implosion. And of course, Russia with its, in this economic warfare with the West, who's getting harmed worse? The flexible free market that is adapting They are working day and night now to solve Germany's energy problem. And they will figure out a way. Maybe Germany will suffer, but they'll figure out a substitutes. You know, I just read the other day, they're operating the first trains in Germany entirely on hydrogen power, right? So imagine the technology that's going to come out of solving this problem when the free market puts its mind to it. Because there's billions or even trillions involved in fixing this problem. And in Russia, nobody's fixing it because the dictator wakes up in the morning, he's got his agenda, and that's all that gets done in the country. No creativity, paint by numbers. And this is why they have failed in Ukraine so far. And it's why they're, even before the war starts, they're dissolving. I heard on the West Coast, the Chinese ships, they're not coming in the numbers they were coming before. You've got empty berths now. They're starting to draw back from us. That's another bad sign that something's going to happen. So I just wanted to give that as a kind of background.
Yeah, that's very helpful. So
yeah.
Jeff, we're going to now jump into the Q&A portion of the interview, which I've got a few more questions for you, which we'll get into. But before we do, I want to bring up your website here for people to see, because which is just, let me pull it up real quick, jrnyquist.blog. So this is where you write. This is where you're very active. You have an email list, right, that people can sign up to if people want to support your work. But this has been a wealth of information for me, and it's been one of the main blogs that I've looked to understand, especially what's happening with communism and what they're doing. So is there any other thing that you want to share with people before we head over to that Q&A?
I have a new book out. It's called The Lies We Believe In, and it's available on Amazon. So The Lies We Believe In. And of course, my other book, which is smaller, and I think it's a good overview, is called The Fool and His Enemy. Yeah, there it is. The Lies We Believe In. China, Russia, and the Communist Revolution in America.
I would also recommend people reading your book, which I believe is called Origins of the Fourth World War. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Yes, I'm about halfway into it, and it's like, it's prophetic, actually.
Well, I started writing it 35 years ago, and I put it in the desk drawer, and a Russian friend said, "When are you going to publish that thing?" I said, "Well, when finally there's some openness to the idea." And there was a little bit in 1998. I got invited on the Art Bell show. Art Bell heard about the manuscript and had me on. So it got published because he urged me to do it. And then I just started, I was invited to write columns for, Newsmax and WorldNet Daily and Financial Sense. And so I started that way. But yeah, my thing was understanding political science and sociology and the Cold War and stuff. And I got lucky. I looked at the defector literature, and you could read the future if you read that, because the defectors, they had access, some of them, to strategic plans. And you look at the strategic plan, and then you look at current events, you go, wait a minute, they're still on that track. And then you can then figure out from there. So it's kind of a cheat. It's not really, I'm not clairvoyant. It's just a trick.
Well, maybe it's just that you go into these subjects without these preconceived notions, and you naturally find the truth in things.
You have to get out of yourself. You have to leave your own cultural prejudices and assumptions behind. Yeah. You really have to try to strip yourself of those things.
Yeah. All right. So we're going to now hop over to Rise TV for the Q&A. I also want to, once we get over there, I want to talk to you a little more about China, and specifically these videos that we're seeing coming out of China with these, what look like concentration camps, shipping container fields of what look like small prisons. So I want to get your thoughts on that and what that means, if that's some sort of part of the war preparation, et cetera. But we've also got a lot of questions that are pouring in from people that are watching. So folks, if you want to come join that Q&A with us, there's a link for a free trial for Rise TV in the description below. It's an amazing streaming platform, and we've got a lot of amazing content. Plus, I also publish Deep Insight with Man in America, though, which is a fully produced series that you can only watch over on Rise TV. So I hope you come join us. And we'll get into the questions over there. So Dom, you can go ahead and cut the public streams. And so Jeff, and this is what I want to ask you about, and I should have got the video ready ahead of time, but I'm seeing these videos that are coming out of China of what look like thousands upon thousands of shipping containers lined up that have little AC units and windows with bars on them. And while it looks like maybe these were at some point set up for quarantine, for COVID, which could be very well true, I also look at things with China, a lot of the lens that you look at things, that what they're doing, a lot of their actions as it relates to COVID are actually in preparation for war. And so